Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we begin our study of the book of Kings, Sefer Milachim. This book is also one long book which has been divided into two. Traditionally, though, this is just one book, but since it's been divided into two, we're going to call it the first book of Kings, Milachim Aleph. And this story picks up where the last book of Shmuel left off. We are still during the days of the monarchy of King David, and we start off this book at the end of David's life and the succession, the choice of succession, who is going to succeed David. Now, we, of course, remember from our study of the book of Shmuel, the book of Samuel together, the reign of David, his victories, his rise to monarchy, how he united the kingdom, how he subdued the surrounding nations and created an empire. However, he did not build a temple. God had told him not to build a temple that would wait for his son. We also learned how everything started taking a turn for the worse after the terrible story that took place, David's sin with the Bat Sheba, the married woman Bat Sheba, and how everything after that story unraveled. And one of the things that we noticed and we pointed out as we studied the book of Shmuel was how the guilt that David felt and how he didn't have the strength and the ability to act in many cases, like that his withdrawal into himself crippled him, and thus resulted in many of the problems. Like, for example, his refusal to criticize and chastise Amnon after he raped his sister Tamar, and he didn't criticize Avshalom when he killed Amnon, and so David just felt so guilty himself that he didn't feel able to criticize anyone else. At this point, at the end of his life, so much has happened after that sin of Bathsheba, so much suffering. David lost one son that was the first child born to Bathsheba. He lost Tamar was raped by her brother. Amnon was killed by his brother. Avshalom was killed in battle. David had lived through several mutinies, rebellions, civil wars against his reign. He did survive them, but all of this was a result. All of this death and destruction was a result of his sin, as predicted. That as he was told that he was going to be punished and that his family was going to suffer a lot of death and destruction because of his sin. Now, at the end of his life, we have an image of David completely retreated into himself, and unable to take charge and perform what is really going to be and should be the last and most important, and on a certain level, act of his monarchy, and that is establish a successor, so that the monarchy will continue on and establish stability in the kingdom. And it was up to David to do that. But here we have an image of David not doing anything, but just completely withdrawn into himself. V'hamelech David zokein, the King David was elderly, he was old. This is verse 1, chapter 1. Bo bayamim, he was on in years. Vayichasuhu babegadim, and they covered him with clothing. V'lo yicham lo, but he could not get warm. Now this image is one of a physical ailment of him being old and therefore he just could not get warm. However, one cannot escape the imagery of him being severely depressed, especially as we go through this chapter. We'll see that when spurred into action, he was able to act. He was able to get up and do, which we will see later on. So at this point, I kind of tend to see this more as a psychological depression than a physical ailment. which is why why they couldn't warm him up. They covered him with clothes. Vayomer lo avadav, and his avadim, his servants, said to him, Yivakshu ladoni hamelach, let us look for our master the king, Na'arav Hisula, a young virgin girl, V'yamdolif ne'amelach, and let her stand before the king, Utihilo sochenes, and she can be an attendant for him. She can stand. Sochenes means to stand over him, to hover over him and give him what he needs. V'shachva b'cheikecha, she can lay in your lap. V'cham ladoni hamelach, and she can warm our master the king. One wonders if these avodav, if these servants are really kind of reminding David of what he's most upset about. Bringing this young girl to him in this situation, one wonders what their intention was here exactly. And if anything, we're going to find out soon that if anything, what this really did was remind David of his sin of Bathsheba, rather than give him any comfort. And they looked for a beautiful girl, b'chol gvul Yisrael, in all the boundaries of Israel. And they found a girl named Avishag from the city of Shunam. And they brought her to the king. She was a very, very, very beautiful girl. And she became his attendant, and she served him. But the king did not consort with her. He was not intimate with her, which again, one gets the feeling as one starts to read, one thinks, oh, he's just very old and therefore he can't consummate the relationship just because of his age. But then as we continue to read, one gets more of an impression that he just wasn't interested. He was depressed. Adoniyahu ben Chagit, and David had a son, Adoniyahu, who was the younger brother of Avshalom, who one would imagine would have been technically the next in line. He was mitnasei lemar. He was being boasting and being haughty and arrogant, saying, "Ani emloch, I am going to be king." Because David wasn't taking the initiative to designate someone as the king, one of his sons. So Adoniyahu stood up and said, I'll be the king. It's not clear. Some understand this as him rebelling during David's life, and some understand this as him simply being arrogant and assuming that he's going to be king. But either way, he didn't ask David. He just got up and said it, because David was sitting in his room doing, curled up under the blanket and not saying or not doing so. He took the opportunity and the initiative. Vayaslo rechavu forashim, and he made for himself riders and chariots. V'chamishim ish ratzim lefanav, and 50 men running in front and calling out, announcing him as the king. V'lo atzavo aviv miyamav lemar. This young man, his father had never been reprimanded him his entire life. One gets the image of a spoiled young man who his father never scolded him, never reprimanded him, never ever criticized him. So, and why is the verse saying this? Because it wants you to understand, because of David's depression and his feelings of guilt about what he had done wrong, he simply could not bring himself to criticize even his own children, even doing the fatherly duties that a father is supposed to do. And this is a very deep insight into the mind of someone who is guilt-ridden. A person who is guilt-ridden and is humble, as David was, finds himself unable to criticize others, even when it's appropriate to do so. He never said, Madua kocha asisa, why have you done such and such? In other words, whatever he did wrong, David never criticized him. V'gam hu tov tohar, he was also very nice in appearance, ma'od, he was a very good-looking man. V'yoso yolda achrei Avshalom, and he was born immediately after Avshalom. Avshalom, who we studied before, and he was described as a very good-looking, handsome man. Vayihu dvarav im Yoav ben Surya, and his words, in other words, he I'm sorry, I'm looking for the right word, where he conferred, as I see, with Yoav, who was the commander of David's army, V'im Evyatar HaKohen, and Evyatar, who was the priest. Now, Evyatar is the priest who was loyal, the one who sought refuge with David all the way back in the beginning of David's career, and now he is going with Adoniyahu. And one would imagine, did they have in mind to rebel against David, or did they have in mind that, well, Adoniyahu would be the proper person to take over after David, because they did not know David's wishes for the succession. Vaya'azru acharei Adoniyahu, and therefore they went after Adoniyahu, having no instruction from David otherwise. They went ahead. However, V'tzadok HaKohen, the other prominent Kohen, who we've known about from the book of Samuel as well, named Tzadok, Adoniyahu ben Yehoyada, who is another one of the military leaders who were also familiar with one of the powerful heroes of David's army, V'nasan Hanavi, and this is the third person who was not with the other one, the prophet Nathan, V'Shim'i v'Re'i, and Shim'i and Re'i, these are others, V'Hagiborim, and the other mighty warriors, Asher LeDavid, that were loyal to David, Lo Hayum Adoniyahu, they did not go with Adoniyahu, because they realized and understood that it has to come from David, not from Adoniyahu himself, and they stayed loyal to David and did not go along with this plan to install Adoniyahu as the king. Vayizbach Adoniyahu tzonu v'karu meri, and Adoniyahu went and he brought a feast, and slaughtered sheep and cattle and fattened the cows. Im even hazocheles, at the stone of Zochelet, which must have been a big prominent stone where they would bring sacrifices. Asher Eitzel Ein Rogel, which is near Ein Rogel. Vayikras kol echav b'nei hamelech, and he called all of his brothers, the entire king's family, Ulchol Anshe Yehuda avdei hamelech, and he called all of the people of Judah, those that served the king. So they have this whole party going on, but he knows that those other important people were not coming along and were not part of this celebration, because Adoniyahu realized that they were waiting for instructions from David, and they were not about to go along with this. And it seems clear that they also understood that David probably had a different plan. Vet Nasan Hanavi, Nathan the prophet, Adoniyahu ve'at hagiborim, ve'et Shlomo achiv, and one of his brothers, that is his brother Solomon, Shlomo lo kara, he did not call. We don't know much about Shlomo here. All we know is that he was the next son born to Bat Sheba. Bat Sheba, after David married her, had a son who died, and then she had Shlomo. And all we know about Shlomo is that the Navi, the prophet, Nasan, called him Yedidia, beloved of God. So we get the impression that Shlomo had the nature about him, which was as a godly person, a person faithful to God, for whom Nasan would give him the name Yedidia, beloved of God. And so it seems clear that even Adoniyahu understood that Shlomo was his primary contender, was his primary opponent of his brothers to take over the kingdom. Nasan knew that and understood that Shlomo was the right one to be king. We're at this point. Vayomer Nasan el Bat Sheba. Nathan said to Bat Sheba, Aim Shlomo, the mother of Shlomo, Lamer, as follows: Halo shamat, have you not heard? Ki molach Adoniyahu ben Chagit va'adonenu David lo yada, that Adoniyahu has taken over the kingship, and our master David doesn't even know that Adoniyahu is walking around pretending he's the king. So here we have the prophet taking the initiative, realizing that this is wrong, understanding that an arrogant person like Adoniyahu is not the proper king, but Shlomo, who is the Yedidia, the beloved of God, right? Shlomo is the rightful king and should be. So he tells his Shlomo's mother, Bat Sheba, let me give you advice. Umaltiep nashech, and you could save your life, v'et nefesh b'nei Shlomo, and the life of your son Shlomo. Of course, knowing that if Adoniyahu would become king after David's death, that Bathsheba and Shlomo's lives would obviously be in danger. And this was his advice to her. L'chi uvoi el hamelach, David, go to the king David, v'yomarta elav, and say to him, Halo ata Adoni hamelach, behold you, or did not you, my master the king, nishbata la'amos chalemar, did you not make a oath to your servant, saying as follows, Ki Shlomo b'nech, that your son David, Shlomo, that in other words, my son Shlomo, Yimloch acharai, he will be the king after me, V'hu yeshev al kisi, and he will be the one that sits on my throne. U'madu malach Adoniyahu, and why is it that Adoniyahu is now the king? In other words, go in there pretending that you don't realize that David doesn't know. So you're not going, and bring up to him this promise that David made to me, Bathsheba, that my son Shlomo is going to be the king. Now, we have never heard this promise before. This promise has never been revealed to us in the verses. But apparently, David had told Bathsheba, and one would imagine that this was, Bathsheba was obviously not, the way he treated her, he took her away from her husband. Her husband was a loyal husband, and arranged for his death. And then, because of that sin, they lost their first child. And now, one way that David made up this, made up to Bathsheba would be, and this is how the traditional way of understanding this was, from the rabbinic tradition, that David made a promise to Bathsheba that I will make sure that your son Shlomo will take over the monarchy and will become the king. So even though this is not something that's explicitly written in the verse, this is something that's understood. Now, if Shlomo is supposed to be king, why did you let Adoniyahu become king? And that's what you should say. Hine odach medaberet shamim malach. And while you are speaking at the time with the king, v'ani avo acharayach, I will come right after you, umilesiet dvarayach, and I will back up your words. So by having this 1-2 punch, it'll become like this thing, like people are just coming into the king, bringing this news, will jolt him into action. And this kind of defies the image of David as being too sick to act, rather makes him too depressed to act. And Nathan, the Navi, the prophet, Nathan, understood that David could act. We just need to wake him up. We need to remind him how important this is, and we need to get him to act. So this is the plan, and in our next podcast, we're going to see how this plan works and whether or not David will be aroused to action to install the proper king to succeed him, Shlomo. Thank you so much for studying our first installment, our first podcast in the Book of Kings. Looking forward to studying this entire book together. Have a wonderful day.